Hello. This is the first of a series of short videos designed to help us move our course units to a blended learning model. In this first one, we're just going to look at some of the terminology and concepts in this space, not because any of them are particularly complicated, but rather because they're used by different people to mean slightly different things, and we thought it'd be a good start to pin them down to what we mean in this series. The first of these is distance learning, and here we're just talking about where the students are located with respect to you. Distance learning simply means the students aren't physically at the University of Manchester, they're studying from somewhere else. The implication here, of course, is that they're going to be communicating with you electronically and accessing learning materials electronically as well. An extension to this is transnational learning, and at one level, this is just distance learning that crosses national boundaries. But it does come with some extra complications relating to time zones, language, culture, and politics. Another phrase that's used in this area a lot, and this can be a bit problematic because it's used to mean a lot of different things, is online learning. In this series, we're simply using online to refer to the mechanism that students use to communicate and access materials, nothing more than that. What's important to point out here is that distance, transnational, and online, at least the way we're using them, are just characteristics, they're not philosophies or pedagogies. The other phrase in this space is flipped learning, and we'll come back to that one in a little while. The definition of blended learning on Wikipedia is as good as any, actually. Blended learning is an approach to education that combines online educational materials and opportunities for interaction online with traditional place-based classroom methods. It requires physical presence of both teacher and student, with some elements of student control over time, place, path, or pace. And there are a couple of aspects to this that I want to highlight. The first is that blended learning requires physical presence of both teacher and student. This is something where at least some components of the model take place in the real world. The other aspect is the student control over time, place, path, or pace. And this is really positive in terms of widening participation because it gives students more control over how and when they learn so they can work around other factors in their lives. It's notoriously difficult to measure the effectiveness of teaching methods, but there is some modest evidence, for example from this report commissioned by the Gates Foundation, that blended learning is more effective than either face-to-face teaching or completely online delivery alone. Perhaps the most important aspect of blended learning are these two phrases here: synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous, students and lecturers are present at the same time and activities happen live. Asynchronous, lecturers create or curate material that students access at their own pace. And I have to say, the first time I came across these, I was quite sceptical. It felt as though they were unnecessarily technical terms being applied to maybe a simpler concept. But as I started thinking through what might replace these phrases, does synchronous mean face-to-face? Well, not necessarily, because it may well be that you're communicating with the students electronically, live over a video link, and so on. And I came to the conclusion that these are exactly the right bits of terminology because we specifically are talking about the relationship in time between different activities, whether these activities are happening where the students and the lecturers are communicating in real time or whether they're not. If we look at a traditional lecture course, it might look something like this. So perhaps you might have a traditional lecture at the beginning of the week. If it's really traditional, this will be a series of explanations, the sort of sage on the stage model, describing or explaining various concepts. There might be some attempt to make it more interactive by perhaps putting an interactive quiz or a question and answer session. But the reality is that the constraints of the physical space do limit the kinds of active learning that you can do. If you're in a tiered lecture theatre and you have no control about how the students have seated themselves, then doing active learning activities like group activities is actually very difficult. And so these tend to be fairly didactic communication. Let's assume that there's another kind of lecture of a similar kind of structure that happens later on in the week, and then that pattern repeats throughout the semester with some practical activities and maybe examples classes interleaved between them. In a blended model, it might look something like this. You might give the students 15 minutes of pre-recorded video to watch, ask them to complete an online quiz, maybe look at another 10 minutes of pre-recorded video and then do some calculations or exercises, and then coordinate with their peers to peer mark those questions. And this can happen in their own time. It really doesn't matter whether or not they go off and do other things between watching the videos, as long as they've completed those activities before you synchronize with them later on in the week. Maybe you then ask them to do something like a 15-minute reading and construct some questions for when you are going to get together in a synchronous activity later in the week to have some kind of discussion. And again, it doesn't matter at exactly what point they do those things, as long as they happen before the meeting. Then later in the week, there might be a scheduled synchronous activity, and it might look something like this. It might be that in a flat classroom, you do 15 minutes of worked examples working through something on a board. You then get them to work in groups on similar examples, and then maybe end the session with 15 minutes of discussion of some kind. In terms of the time spent by the lecturer, here we've got less than an hour in the synchronous activity. If we put aside the upfront cost of creating the videos and quizzes and so forth, that means that in the steady state, we've spent less than an hour compared to the 2 hours for the traditional lectures. So to stick to the same kind of budget, you might insert something like a virtual office hour earlier on in the week, where you don't have to be at anywhere specific, but at a particular time you will be available to answer questions electronically. The study budget for the student is similar. Here we're asking them to do some work up front and then do some activities in the classroom together, rather than go to 2 lectures. Returning to this idea of the flipped classroom, in a traditional model, you as a teacher would be there at the lecture, and you'd then expect the student in their own time to do some homework, which might be revising the content of the lecture. The flipped model, the student works on their own to consume the lecture, and then you're present at the classroom activity in order to consolidate that learning. And so flipped learning is one type of blended learning, although it's not the only type. And finally, there's a wrinkle that we need to confront here, given the current circumstances, which is that blended learning assumes face-to-face teaching. It assumes that some of the activities take place in a classroom and that you optimize the time used so that things that can be consumed online can be consumed online, and that things that are best done face-to-face happen in the real world face-to-face. And of course, it's completely uncertain at the moment as to whether that's going to be realistic for the short term. So one of the extra complications that we're going to have to bear in mind as we move towards a blended learning model is that some of the synchronous activities that we'd ideally like to take place in a physical classroom might have to take place online. In the next video, we'll be looking at some practical strategies for translating the kind of course units that we currently have into something that's suitable for delivery online. Thanks for listening. See you next time.